A funder behind the controversial hit movie Sound of Freedom has been arrested and charged with child kidnapping. Now, Sound of Freedom, of course, tells the dramatized true story of Tim Ballard, played by Jim Caviezel, a federal agent who launched Operation Underground Railroad, OUR, a nonprofit organization focused on rescuing children from sex trafficking rings. Now, generally, that would be a pretty good goal. Okay. Yeah, who doesn't agree with that? Yes, rescue the children. Rescue the children. Unfortunately, officers had to rescue children from one of the funders here named Fabian Marta. So now he contributed to the $5 million crowdfunded investment that helped spread the movie around to different theaters. And Marta has been arrested on, again, child kidnapping charges. He was arrested on July 21st by the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department under the code RSMO 565.115. So that is kidnapping in the first degree. And although the specific details, according to Radar Online, of the case have not been shared by officials yet, due to the information stated on the file, this would mean that Marta is accused of removing a non-family member below the age of 14 without parental consent. So understand what that means. RSMO 565.115, that is the code, right? It means not a custody dispute. It means non-family, non-relation. Here's the statute. Quote, a person that commits the offense of child kidnapping, if he or she is not a relative of the child within the third degree, and knowing he or she has no right to do so, removes a child under the age of 14 without consent of the child's parents or guardian, or confines such child for a substantial period of time without such consent. So based on what we know right now, this guy, well, it's not looking good for him, okay? Felony kidnapping is what this is under. Has a minimum sentence of 10 years with a potential life sentence. Now, this isn't to say that, movie bad. Everyone who donated or saw this movie, bad. No. This is to say, though, that at least one person who had donated to this movie because they claimed to have cared so much about the trafficking of children, it looks like that there was some projection here. Okay? And honestly, that does not come as a surprise. Seems to me that the people who claim to be the biggest protectors of children, who seem to be screaming about pedophiles, oh, they're everywhere, they tend to end up being the ones the children need to be protected from. And you see that a lot, unfortunately, in QAnon. Well, how can I say that? Well, let me give you a list, because there's a big list of QAnon-related people who are actually pedophiles. Yes. For example, Pennsylvania resident Philip Godlewski, one of the big QAnon YouTubers, pleaded guilty back in 2010 to a misdemeanor charge for the corruption of a minor. So what does that mean? Well, he actually pled down. He allegedly carried on a sexual relationship with a 15-year-old, a minor, while he was 28 and working as a high school baseball coach. Now, after pleading guilty to the corruption of a minor charge, Godlewski served 3 months under house arrest and 20 months on probation. That's just one example. Ruben Verstigi, a former RNC digital strategist who created social media ads to promote former President Donald Trump's re-election campaign, was arrested as part of a federal child sexual exploitation investigation. In messages obtained by federal investigators, he had been, apparently he had said, quote, babies are some of my biggest turn-ons. So, an absolutely disgusting, horrifying person, and yet this guy was a big, we need to protect the children. Also a big anti-abortion activist, which kind of makes sense. You want to save the babies so that you can victimize them later. But not too much later. Ugh. Disgusting people. There's more. Tim Nolan, a former Kentucky judge and Trump delegate, he was charged with multiple human trafficking offenses after an investigation found that he had a pattern of paying minors for sex and in some cases even filmed it. George Nader, another Trump associate, had been arrested on child porn charges in 2019 and had already been charged years before for similar crimes. Ben Gibson, a Republican candidate in Louisiana, ran a campaign post on Facebook tagged QAnon, and after lost the election, was arrested and charged with 4 counts of pornography involving juveniles, children. So those are just some of the examples. QAnon. If you're looking for the pedos, I mean, there's a list right there. They all got something in common, too. But look, it's not a surprise to me now to see one of the funders of a movie about a very real issue, sex trafficking of minors, that happens to be a big hit among right-wingers, be funded by someone who may himself be a trafficker. Who some online, by the way, also allege would hold grooming parties for young girls. Now, I'm not going to speak to the veracity of these allegations, again, because I don't know. But Jim Stewartson wrote on Twitter, an anti-disinformation activist, calls himself. Here's what he said. Sound of Freedom funder Fabian Marta, who grooms women and girls into all ages, sugar baby / sugar daddy parties, has been arrested for felony child kidnapping. I don't know if the sugar baby, sugar daddy parties is true, so I just want to note that it wouldn't surprise me. Just wouldn't surprise me. The kidnapping alone charge alone, though, is pretty disturbing, and I think is enough to make a good case that there's a lot of projection going on here when it comes to the QAnon obsessed right wing. Again, the projection here, okay, they see pedophiles and groomers everywhere except the places where they're actually at. And I say that because what they're doing is they're always falsely accusing members of the LGBTQ community of being groomers. When in reality, of course, the groomers are in the house. The call is coming from inside the house. Sometimes literally the House of Representatives, when we're talking about former Republican Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, who, again, is a pedophile. So now, look, it's funny because there are members of the right wing that have accused Disney and others, and movie theaters even, of trying to bury this movie. Oh, you're ignoring child trafficking. No, that's a very serious issue. Now, that said, the people that are actually not helping victims of child trafficking are groups like QAnon. So they don't help victims, they don't prevent trafficking, and actually they often more often than not, get in the way of legitimate law enforcement investigations and actions that are looking to stop trafficking. They spread false information about how trafficking happens, who's doing it, for whatever reasons, and who's affected most. Now, for example, they accused Wayfair of sex trafficking children without any evidence. Now, according to the anti-trafficking organization Polaris Project, vulnerable communities happen to be most at risk of being trafficked, which the Department of Justice defines as exploiting a person for labor, services, or commercial sex. Now, sex traffickers, they say, normally target vulnerable communities by luring them in with the promises or offers of food, clothes, attention, friendship, love, and a seemingly safe place to sleep. So, again, they go after vulnerable people. They're not going after a white suburban mother's kid, which apparently seems to be a lot of the fears of these QAnon people. Now, according to survivors, actual survivors of trafficking, this hurts them. So let me give you an example here of how QAnon hurts them. Her name is Christy Croft. She's a sex trafficking survivor and activist. And she talked to Insider about this, her experience, and basically how she feels when she comes across posts on Facebook about QAnon. Quote, as a survivor, when I see it, I feel exploited again. I feel like my trauma and the trauma of people like me is being exploited for purposes other than ending trafficking. Like, you know, going after LGBTQ people. Because let's be honest, that's what QAnon is actually doing. They're taking this, again, legitimate fear of child trafficking, something that actually happens and it's horrible, and then weaponizing that against vulnerable communities, the very vulnerable communities that are the ones being exploited in the first place. Now she says, quote, "It's really infuriating when you have survivors who have lived experience and are working full-time in this field, i.e. preventing and fighting against child trafficking, quote, and have helped tons and tons of survivors saying, actually, that's not quite right. And you have someone with no experience and no professional expertise with a whole day of internet research on unverified sites telling you, you don't know your own life." Oh my God, that is probably the truest thing I've ever seen. And actually one of the most saddest and most frustrating things. Again, you have, people that have worked in this field, and you can apply it to, for example, climate science, right? Where they're coming out and they're saying, well, we have all of this data. Here's what we need to do. Here's what's going on. And then you have some rando, on Facebook or whatever site, doesn't matter, and social media comes up and says, oh, actually, that's bullshit. I heard from this. And then it's a group that's bankrolled by oil companies. It's not actually happening, There's more. Getting back to one of the survivors here, Sumir's Pirana Guzman, who was a child that was kidnapped from Honduras, smuggled into the United States by human traffickers, and repeatedly sexually assaulted, told Insider this, quote, "It's really difficult for people to really differentiate the super sensationalism of human trafficking. People don't really know what human trafficking is. And they're creating these types of stories to distract from the real issue. It's easier to scream like bloody hell that there's an issue here rather than actually doing something to acknowledge that maybe we are consuming products that are produced by forced labor." Again, another, these are people, these are children that are victims of trafficking that are forced to work for corporations. Or we are maybe staying in hotel rooms where someone has been sexually exploited. Now, again, one of the biggest ironies here is the fact that when it comes to child sex trafficking, LGBTQ youth, right, are at particular risk because they make up 40% of homeless youth. Now, why is it that? Why is that? Well, that's because LGBTQ youth are usually forced out of their homes because of who they are, because of their identity, whether they're trans or gay. They're kicked out of, let's be honest, conservative religious homes because of who they are. They get out in the street and they're sexually exploited. They are trafficked. Again, by the same people who claim, oh my God, we got to stop the pedophiles. Well, I'm a proud member of QAnon. I read the latest Q drop, and let me tell you what, the storm is coming. Those are the same people that are kicking LGBTQ youth, if they happen to be part of their family, onto the street to then be trafficked. It is just irony after irony, and it's just horrifying, the reality of the situation. Now, this is according to a group called Polaris, that is an anti-trafficking group, obviously. Polaris also says that girls in Black communities are at higher risk, primarily because they're likely to live in underserved areas. So LGBTQ plus folk and Black girls. Those are the majority that are being trafficked in this country. Now, do you see any of the QAnon-obsessed right-wingers talk about that? Talk about who's really affected by this. And not just the fact that it's, sex exploitation, but it's also labor. Did they talk about this? Do they do anything to help those communities? No, they criminalize those communities. They demonize them. They go after Black people incessantly. They go after the LGBTQ community. Again, QAnon, weaponized to attack the LGBTQ plus community. That's what they do. And the final irony on top is, some of the same people who claim to be wanting to protect the children, they're the ones that end up abusing them. Now, as for Tim Ballard, he went on the conspiracies, okay? He recently, in a podcast appearance, told Jordan Peterson that the, quote, adrenochrome harvesting is real. So he's full QAnon. The actor that plays him recently also went on Steve Bannon's podcast claiming that, quote, the whole adrenochrome empire is driving demand for trafficked children. It's an elite drug that they've used for many years. So, look, full stop. This is a QAnon movie. Now, it talks about a very real issue, just like QAnon does, in the fact that there are children that are being trafficked. But then they ignore the realities of the situation and use it to do a political conspiracy, mainly against Democrats. And so, look, here's the thing, the lesson that I take from all this. Do we need more advocacy against trafficking of all kinds? Absolutely. Of course, especially when it comes to children. Yes, more advocacy and more help and donations for real groups that are doing real good. Now, when it comes down to it, though, The Sound of Freedom is not a good way to learn about trafficking, even though it does not, the movie itself does not go into QAnon. It does not go into adrenochrome conspiracy theories. Let's be fair about that. And it is, again, a dramatized version of something, a government agent going after child trafficking. And again, we should all be in favor of stopping child trafficking. That said, at the end of the day, this is more of a distraction. And it's really just clickbait for people that are QAnon. It's something to make them feel good, to make them feel like they're doing something, when in reality, they're not doing anything. They're continuing to perpetuate harm against the very victims that they claim they want to help.